I'm Riley Chow, and I'm joined by Kevin Jacobsen and Luca Giliberti, and we are talking about the Best Comedy Series race. We are guaranteed 8 nominees this year. Ultimately, I think we're all expecting this to come down to a matchup between Marvelous Mrs. Maisel and Schitt's Creek, pending nominations, and everyone's expecting them to be joined by returning nominees Curb Your Enthusiasm and The Good Place. And there actually is room for this category to be filled up entirely by returning nominees. We could get Will and Grace for its final season, Modern Family and Silicon Valley for their final seasons, and Blackish also coming back. But I think that's not really what most people are expecting to happen. Dead to Me is widely predicted to be nominated alongside those top 4 that I mentioned. Just quickly, does anyone have any reservations about Dead to Me breaking into this field?
I think if it had been a more crowded field, where we had, returning nominees like Barry or Russian Doll, which, were big players last year. They
Atlanta.
got Atlanta, exactly. These comedy series that have done really well at the Emmys for their eligible seasons. If they had been in contention this year, I think it might have been more difficult for Dead to Me to break in because as well liked as Dead to Me is, I'm not sure if it lives up to some of these other comedy series like Barry or Atlanta, which are a bit more serious, not necessarily in the tone, because Dead to Me is also more of a dramedy, but they're more prestigious, I guess is what you could say. I think it would have had problems getting in, but this year, I feel like the field is wide open enough. The second season was very popular. It came out in May. Christina Applegate put the show on the map last year with her nomination, which I think surprised most of us. And I'm expecting it to see it break into a few categories this year and carry along a few nominations, actually. So yeah. I feel confident in it this year.
I think what you're getting at is that there, I think, was some hope before it came out that it would be this huge thing like the new season of Ozark, where not only does it have this momentum, but it's really building on the momentum. Where here, It kind of more just seems like, yeah, it can get in. It's maybe about the same quality as last season, but it's not this huge.
Yes. It's the same momentum, but I think it, like everyone is saying, it is greatly helped by the fact that all of these other shows are just not here. And so with 8 slots now instead of 7, I just find it even less likely that it can miss to any of these other shows, which I think people are even weaker on figuring out whether they can get in.
Now, Kevin, what about those 4 that I mentioned, Blackish, Modern Family, Silicon Valley, and Will and Grace? You're not predicting any of those. Why not?
I think that the Academy is just going to be in a mode of embracing slightly newer projects than that, personally speaking, just because I do think things happening the way they did this year with the virus, with everyone being home. Yes, you could say, oh, they could just fall back on their old favorites as they always have, but I think that there was more of a discovery with a lot of shows this year, and that is why I am going towards them looking towards the future a bit, just on a general trend. But I do think that this is one of those years that is kind of impossible to predict which way they're going to go because of, again, what has happened in 2020, that if you're just kind of predicting things to go along the same way that they always have, I think that you're making a mistake.
Yeah, that's very true. Luca, you are predicting one of those 4. You've got Silicon Valley, which admittedly has never missed series. It's never missed writing. It's never missed directing. Now everyone except you is predicting it to miss in all those categories.
Yeah, I mean, I'm predicting it for the exact reasons that you just mentioned, and because as we've mentioned, this field is just very wide open, and it's very difficult to see what's going to happen, if they're going to embrace newer shows, if they're going to go back to their old favorites. I think there will be a combination of those. I feel like Silicon Valley, as you said, it has never missed. I understand that its final season didn't arrive with a lot of buzz, and I don't think it'll make the splash that it usually makes at the Emmys. But when there are 8 slots, I don't think it will be that difficult for it to get all these, name checks. In this case, because voters might just want to vote for it because they have in the past. And it's not like this field is so crowded that it couldn't get in on that alone. I also have Insecure in, which I just recently put in. That's a show I feel like that is gaining a lot of momentum. Its fourth season has been very praised. I think that is something that can definitely benefit from what is happening in the country at the moment. And I feel like that's the show that could surprise. It's never been nominated before. Issa Rae has received a nomination. It's received one or two tech nominations, but I think this has to be the year for it to break through in other categories. And I think this 8-series lineup is really going to benefit it.
Yeah, Kevin, you've got Insecure as well. So why is
that? Same reason as Luca. I do think it is sort of trending more than it usually has, and it aired in the exact right sort of time slot that is friendly to Emmy voters. And it's kind of an auteur-driven show that, even though it hasn't gotten in previously, I just think that competition-wise, it was a lot more difficult for Insecure to get in those other years. And the fact that Issa Rae was at least nominated once proves that they are at least aware of the show, and it is HBO. And it's not one of those shows that I feel that confident in getting in, but just looking at the rest of the competition, it's sort of just by default makes the most sense to me, because I feel like a lot of the other shows have more cons to them than pros. So, and it's also, in terms of the auteur thing, is the same reason I'm going with Rami, which is a show that I defended on previous slugfests as one of those shows that is kind of on the rise, even if it hasn't reached that sort of Fleabag-esque plateau as much. It's still such a huge support from the critics, I think. Not universal praise, but still, one of those shows that people are always defending as one of the best sort of under the radar shows that you need to be watching. And Rami is I think a sort of a genial presence. And yeah, I think that makes sense to me, those two. And then it's just the 8th slot is once again just driving me crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, just going back to Insecure, I mean, that one and Better Things are neck and neck in Gold Derby's odds for 8th and 9th place. And I do feel like they can be compared because they came out at the same time. They're both these auteur shows, came out the same year, I think. But whereas Insecure, it got that one nomination for Issa Rae for the season when Insecure was on after Game of Thrones. Better Things has kind of been able to hold out a bit more. Pamela Adlon has been nominated twice at the Emmys, and whereas they were both recognized by the casting and editing societies at various points during their run so far, Better Things is the one that has actually been able to hold on with them. So I think there is still a level of consistent industry support, where I wonder if Insecure was kind of more just a blip. Like, it does seem like tons of people, maybe more than ever, were talking about it recently, but it wasn't really reflected in the ratings. I'm skeptical about that one, but then again, HBO is always a good bet. Luca, what do you think about Rami and Better Things?
Yeah, my problem with both of them is that what you've mentioned about Better Things is very important, is that Pamela Adlon has been nominated 2 times now, and the show has been able to get into these different groups. But my problem with both shows is that they feel very small compared to some of these other shows we have in this race. If you just look at the front runners, Schitt's Creek, Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, The Good Place, these are just much bigger shows. And my fear for both Better Things and Rami is that they are just indeed very small. I think Better Things would probably have the better chance just because Pamela Adlon has that track record and because Academy members have acknowledged it with nominations for her. Whereas Rami, yes, Rami Youssef won the Globe earlier this year, which I think gave the show a bit of a boost that it needed. But its second season had buzz, but I don't know if it had enough buzz to break into the comedy series race. I'm not saying that Rami Youssef can't get into lead actor. I'm not saying that the show can't get into writing. I just feel like its biggest hurdle might be series, just because it doesn't feel big enough. But I would not be surprised to see it happen, because this year, I feel like this year is probably the one where we'll see so many surprises. But as of now, I'd probably just keep an eye out for it in the writing category, and maybe for Rami Youssef, an actor.
Yeah, Rami, I agree with you. I just think it's too small. I think this is something that a few people like, but I'm not even sure that all the critics are watching it based on, how many reviews it got on Metacritic and Rotten Tomatoes. I think that we were kind of hoping that it would take off like Fleabag, which I think we can say it kind of clearly hasn't. Whereas at least, Insecure is on HBO and kind of fall back on that. Kevin, what do you think about Better Things, and why don't you lead us into your 8th nominee?
Yeah, those are all valid arguments for Better Things. It also does have that sort of FX factor that I don't think there's any other real competition, generally speaking, in terms of FX.
Well, I've got something higher, but yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, I think that Pamela Adlon certainly has a lot of industry respect, and yeah, I could see it. I could see it. I do think it's sort of a situation where any of those three sort of makes sense. It's just depends on how many get in, whether it's just one of these kinds of auteur-driven shows. But my 8th slot is actually The Kominsky Method. It's a show that has gotten into the SAG Ensemble twice, even though it didn't get into Best Comedy Series at the Emmys last year. Again, I do think just the amount of competition there was last year made it in that sort of 8th or 9th position, probably. And so I think it will just sort of naturally rise to the top there. And I don't know how many people are really watching that show, but it is kind of in the demographic of most Academy voters. So it's really, that's all it comes down to. Plus, obviously, the fact that it got in those 2 actors last year, they're at least watching it. And that's half the battle sometimes.
Yeah, I think you nailed it on the head by saying that it could have easily just been in, 8th place last year. I mean, many of us were predicting it after, it won the Golden Globe and it got into SAG and overperformed at SAG. So I think it might have just been sitting in that 8th or 9th place last year, which would be easy for it to get in this year, since so many shows are not in contention and since we have 8 slots now. So I think that's probably the safest bet. I also have it in 8th place, but I do worry that, as you said, we don't know how many people are actually watching it. I'm not sure it appeals to a broad audience. And but if we're predicting Michael Douglas, and if we're predicting the 2 actors, then there's no reason why we shouldn't put it into series this year. Even though if it missed, I wouldn't be shocked, because maybe they get in the 2 actors, but maybe it doesn't have enough support to get into the series race. But as we said, it's so unpredictable this year.
Yeah, it very much is in that default position. At the same time, I feel like if both Michael Douglas and Alan Arkin fell out, nobody would really be that surprised.
No.
I mean, it did manage to hold on at SAG, get those 3 nominations. It got the same 3 nominations at the Golden Globes, so those were very impressive. At the same time, it wasn't able to hold on at Critics' Choice at all. It wasn't able to hold on at AFI. It didn't get picked up by the guilds. So, I kind of wonder, if the show will just be completely forgotten. It is listed on Netflix's campaign website as a priority in the comedy categories. At the same time, I interviewed Paul Reiser last week, and then I started looking up the show and, doing my research, and he seems to be the only one who's doing a press run for the show.
Right.
And, it's not just Michael Douglas and Alan Arkin who are on the show. There's also, Sarah Baker and Lisa Edelstein and all the below the line people, all the writers, directors. And then the other thing I noticed was that the show is kind of like, maybe it's been canceled. It's been 8
Yeah, I don't
months
know.
since the second season
Right.
came out. And like Chuck Lorre hasn't written scripts for the third season because it hasn't been ordered yet. You know,
Right.
even if they renewed it now, like getting renewed 8 months after the previous season has actually come out is very strange for Netflix. So it seems like it's kind of, it needs the series nomination in order to get renewed for, I guess, what would be its third and final season. So
Right.
that's not, it doesn't instill a ton of confidence in me. Yeah.
I guess there are so many other shows that could break in to the category. Modern Family is one I had in for quite a while. Another old favorite, 5-time winner that I thought could have a chance for its final season. I still do think it has a good chance of getting in because, again, it's the series concluded right when everyone was at home watching television, and it might have been this feel good type of show that people were longing for at the time or even now. So I think it's something that can absolutely get in, but at the same time we have new shows that could get in. I think many of us had Run and Space Force in at one point, but both of them arrived, I don't want to say DOA, but both of them weren't as well received as we thought they would be. So I did take both out pretty quickly, especially Run when sort of neared the end of the season, and Space Force just didn't, again, take off. So
Yeah, I think that's kind of my bad, at least, or our bad, in that, we really wanted these to be such great shows so that it would make our jobs easier as pundits. We wouldn't be scrambling as we are now trying to fill these slots. Ultimately, neither was really that well received by audiences. They're both 6 point, something on IMDb.
mhm.
And at this point, with this longer season, with how everybody is at home, they both feel like they were quite a while ago. I'm not sure if they have the legs to sustain themselves to get a series nomination here. I'll talk about what I have in 2 of my slots that I haven't mentioned so far. I've actually got Dave in 6th, which means I'm fairly confident about it. Dave is a show on FX. It's another one of these auteur shows. It didn't get the greatest reviews when it came out because they only sent first few episodes, which were kind of all about dick jokes. And that was fine with me, but it's not for everyone. Whereas later in the season, the episodes got a lot more acclaimed as it went a lot deeper, I guess. And this is a show that I think really appeals to the industry in a way that it lands with them differently than it does with critics. There have been many kind of prominent showrunners from This Is Us or The Eddie or Little America or Watchmen who have been tweeting about the show. The one I point to is on the 10th anniversary of the Lost finale. Damon Lindelof did not post a single thing about Lost on his Instagram. Instead, what he was doing was he was posting about the Dave finale yet again. So I think there is this kind of industry awareness of it. It's also a show about the industry. It's got a lot of industry connections with its executive producer, Kevin Hart. It's got Jeff Schaffer, who's the showrunner of Curb Your Enthusiasm, also showrunning this. The director of the first 3 episodes is Greg Mottala, who did The Newsroom, Superbad. So I think this might be kind of something that really took off or is going to take off with the industry that might surprise the rest of us. Also, to its credit, in more mainstream terms, like it is FX's most watched comedy ever. Now that they have that partnership with Hulu, then everything that they have is so much more accessible. So it's not quite apples to apples, but ultimately it has been seen by more people than Louis or Atlanta, those kinds of things. And then in 8th place in my predictions, I've got Brooklyn Nine-Nine.
I would love for you to explain yourself.
Yeah, so Brooklyn Nine-Nine has obviously been ignored by the Emmys pretty much for its entire run. got nominated a few times for Andre Braugher. It won the stunts category that seems like was almost graded for it. At this point, it's not really getting anything from the Emmys, but I just feel like during this quarantine, people are turning to, Schitt's Creek. That's what we think that they're turning to because it's kind of this escapist show that's been on for a number of years and people just want to feel good and they can binge the whole thing. I feel like Brooklyn Nine-Nine maybe is, going through something similar where it does seem to be popping up on, Netflix's most watched list. And it is, this long running show that people can feel good about watching, all the cop stuff aside.
I mean, that's a pretty big part of it.
It is the show.
Yeah.
I think I was going somewhere, but yeah, Luca, what are you saying there?
I mean, we could see surprises like that happen. My fear with Brooklyn Nine-Nine is that it's just never been embraced, and I feel like it had more buzz at the beginning or the beginning of its run when it was able to get a few acting nominations, but now, I don't know, I feel like it'd be very difficult for it to break in this late in its run. Even though anything really could happen this year. And if it gets in any year, I guess this would be the one. The shows I think we need to keep an eye out for is The Great on Hulu. That's a show that is in the Academy's wheelhouse. I mean, it's in the vein of The Favorite, obviously, since some of the same writers are attached. It depends very much on how big a campaign Hulu mounts for it. And whether, again, that's something I wanted to mention regarding Grammy earlier on as well, is that Hulu just doesn't have a great track record yet outside of Best Drama Series in getting these shows Emmy nominations, especially in the limited category and I guess in the comedy as well. This will really be the year where we see whether it can get a show that isn't The Handmaid's Tale into a series category. And I feel like that's one we should probably keep an eye out for. What about other old favorites like Blackish?
Wait, let me just say about Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I think,
right,
like comparing it to The Great and Rami and Better Things, I feel like we can only have so many of these kind of niche shows nominated in this expanded field. And I feel like Brooklyn Nine-Nine has gotten to that point where it's kind of like The Office and Friends, where it's just being like widely streamed. It has to some extent become this mainstream show that it's kind of weird that the Emmys have never, taken care of, given how you can go to like a Brooklyn Nine-Nine trivia night at your local bar or whatever. So I do wonder though, like what other kind of more widely seen shows we should be considering. I look at the Best Drama Series lineup last year where we had an 8th nominee because of a close film. And I think we can say that 8th nominee was Bodyguard because it only had one other nomination. And Bodyguard was a show that, maybe it was seen as not quite prestigious enough since it was so action driven, but it was a show that was like very widely seen that we know of, on Netflix and especially in the UK. So like, I'm wondering if we could see shows like Sex Education, Never Have I Ever, and The End of the Effing World, which seem to have been widely sampled, or even Afterlife.
Yeah, I think there is a situation where we could have one of those things of like one show is not really nominated anywhere else, like Big Love back in the day that only got the one drama series nomination. Like we could very well have like a one-off random show kind of getting into that 8th place slot easily.
What about something like Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist, which is a big, huge push
at the bottom of the ballot with the Z?
Right, exactly. It's a big push from NBC. It's something that would fit into that feel-good type of show that people might gravitate toward at the moment. Even though it doesn't have the highest ratings, I do feel like the critics really went for this one, and Jane Levy, certainly there's some buzz for her. I guess we have The Good Place here, which is probably NBC's biggest push, but I wouldn't be surprised to see something like this. I don't know if the series category is necessarily where it would break through first, but if we're talking about all these escapist feel-good type of shows, then I think that one fits the mold. It fits the mold, even though I don't. Maybe when we see the TCA nominations, maybe we see it included there. That doesn't mean I would put it in my comedy lineup here. But
it did match 7 for 7 last year.
right. Well, yeah. So maybe it's something we might have to consider, but it's not something I would prioritize at the moment.
Yeah, two more that I want to mention are What We Do in the Shadows. That one is from Jermaine Clement, who did Flight of the Conchords. Flight of the Conchords, I think, is one of the strangest nominees that we've ever had in the comedy series race. And I love the show, but I just would not have thought that would appeal to Emmy voters. What We Do in the Shadows has been very well received. And it's also, I think, another one of those shows that's very well connected. It's got Taika Waititi working on it. It had Jesse Armstrong from Succession on it last year. It's got Paul Sims, who's produced a bunch of comedies. So that's something that I think is a possibility. It did get a couple of Emmy nominations last year, and it got its 2 Emmy nominations in categories that are panel-based, where once you are a semi-finalist, then it goes to a panel of judges. So that means that it did make, the top 10, 12, 15, whatever they're using in those categories. So, it might have just been outside a bunch of categories that it could sneak into this year with a more open field. And the other comedy I want to mention is one that I forgot about earlier when I should have been talking about, I should have mentioned when we were talking about shows that have previously been nominated, which is actually my favorite comedy of the year, which is Glow. It's only missed once. It did manage to hold on at a few below-the-line guilds for costumes, production design, makeup, and stunts. I'm not predicting it because it was dropped very suddenly from writing, producing, ensemble. Plus, it didn't even get in last year. But yeah, it's a possibility.
Yeah, and I guess if you're mentioning Netflix, we can't go without mentioning Ryan Murphy, and The Politician is in the mix. Its second season actually they just released the second season not too long ago. It didn't have a lot of buzz. I thought maybe if the second season had arrived with more buzz, I think I would have maybe considered the first season. But I don't feel like its second season actually helped it, so I'm not sure. But it did get the Golden Globe nomination, and it is Ryan Murphy. But it doesn't seem to be a big priority from Netflix, so it's not something I'm really considering here. Maybe in other categories, some of the acting categories, but not here.
All right, and Kevin, what do you think about all these things that we've been talking about?
So I think that anything below Dead to Me is pretty much an uncertainty at this point, and that all of the shows that we have mentioned are absolutely in contention, and it just speaks to how very wide open this entire field is, where again, we don't know if they will go to veteran shows or new shows or a mix of both, because we're also dealing with this virus on top of everything else, plus everything else happening in the world, that there are so many other factors that could come into play this year that could have more of an influence than we think.